Hello, and welcome to the third episode of the Atlas Sports Podcast. Today, we're going to be discussing the potential upcoming second John Morant punishment for flashing a gun on Instagram Live, what the NBA head coaching positions mean in terms of our ranking across the board, and another summer of conference realignment, including Colorado potentially to the Big 12. Let's get into it. I'm Thomas, and this is Chandler. Chandler, what do you initially think should happen to John Morant with an upcoming potential suspension?
Yeah, so this is his second offense. The first time it was, I believe, a 7 game suspension or something like that, and he went down to Florida and rehabbed. That was like on his own, but I guarantee the NBA had a little say in that. This time, it's hard to say because he got repercussed. Everyone thought that, oh, he learned from his mistakes, it's better, and then next thing you know, he is on the live flashing the gun the same time, and even his friend who was the live he was on was like, oh, like he was trying to hide the phone after he saw it because like he knew that that shouldn't be on, but obviously Jaw doesn't. Again, it's hard to say. If I had to put a number on it, I would put it like a 30 game suspension. Like I think it should be something pretty detrimental to him, where he's like, oh man, I need to really make sure I don't do this again, else I'm probably out of the NBA. So I think a 30 game is probably warranted, maybe even a little more, but I don't know what they need to do, but they need to go get that guy some help. Like, you shouldn't be flashing guns when the majority of the NBA fan base are kids or at least younger adults who um, see John Morant as a role model. I mean, to younger kids, John Morant is one of the best things ever because he's super athletic and people love to see him go high flying and jumping over people. And then they see their role models flashing guns on Instagram lives. Some kid could literally be like, "Well, why can't I do the same?" So I think the whole like role model perspective is the thing we need to look into this and find him some help to really stop this action. Um, I don't know what it is they need to do, like maybe legally, but they need to somehow get him the help he needs or whatever it needs for him to stop. But for suspension wise, I think just something pretty detrimental, like 30 games, maybe half the season, something like that to really make sure it hits him hard. Because like the week he got suspended for, basically, like he went into his rehab. He was back with the team then playing the playoffs, you know? So, like, if he would have got suspended for the playoffs, maybe it would have been more like, oh, crap. Like, I should really fix my actions here. But obviously, the suspension and the rehab didn't work because he was in his friend or in the car with a friend flashing guns. So that's kind of what I think. What do you think?
Here's the way that I see the John Morant situation. He flashed the gun on Instagram Live a few months ago now, and he got suspended for 8 games, right? And from what I heard out of that Adam Silver John Morant meeting, was John Morant was very serious about not wanting to flash a gun. Again, he didn't want to be part of that lifestyle. He understood that it was wrong, and it came across as a complete shock to Adam Silver and the NBA heads that he did it again. And I think the punishment initially for just lying and not holding up to that standard that he set for himself should at least be 3 to 4 times worse the second punishment than it is the first punishment. I mean, it's kind of like growing up. Like, if your parents say, don't do this, and you're like, yeah, okay, sounds good. And then you go ahead and do it again. Like, the punishment should be, and usually was for us, a lot worse than the first time go around. So that's why I kind of think it should either be a 3 or 4 times at the 8. So I would put it anywhere between 24 games and 32 games, which is pretty similar to your 30 games. I probably lean more towards the 32 just because the NBA has put so much invested time and money into John Morant, putting him on the face of the NBA, pairing him with Zion, Luca, some of the young stars that we have. And just like you said, so many kids look up to him that you can't have one of your future guys who is one of the most exciting superstars in all of the NBA be around flashing a gun. But I will say, in John Morant's defense, he was not the one to press go live on Instagram, and he was just kind of caught. I mean, I know that there's a saying of like there's no how does it go? Like bad situations don't just like arise essentially. He was on Instagram live with the gun, but it was his friend that recorded him in the first place. And I think his friend and him knew immediately that it was wrong just from like the way you can see the camera just get waved and like put really close to his chest. So I do think that they knew that it was wrong. And I hope John Morant surrounds himself with some better friends and some better guys in the future because you want to be hanging around with guys that are going to try to help you propel your career and not try to detriment it. But if I was Adam Silver, I would make it very clear to John Morant and the rest of the NBA that this is not the league that we're trying to promote. This is not who we're trying to be. We want to keep pushing our international market in a league that's going to be upholding high standards. And so I would probably punish John Morant 32 games for next season, which is 4 times greater than the 8 games that he initially got.
Do you think with Adam Silver saying that it will get announced after the NBA Finals, um do you think that's a market thing just to make sure the NBA Finals gets heightened, or do you think this is like, oh, that's probably more of a serious acquisition and there could be a longer suspension than what we might think?
I think it's a little bit of both, honestly. The NBA Finals, as it is right now, is a little bit worrisome for the NBA. I think there's a ton of worry around the league that putting the Denver Nuggets against the Miami Heat wouldn't have nearly attraction as, say, the two losers in both conference finals or past teams like the Golden State Warriors, Milwaukee Bucks. I mean, these are two teams that just have not established themselves as like a perennial team in the NBA. I know the Nuggets have had the number one record all season long in the West, and they've had Jokic, who's two-time MVP, but no one gets nearly as hyped about the Nuggets as they do about the Lakers per se. So I think Adam Silver really wants this week and maybe the next 2 or 3 weeks, depending on if the finals goes to 7 games, to just be totally focused on the finals. And I also think he's delaying announcing the suspension because he does want a little bit of attention on it, if I'm going to be honest. Like, you don't want negative attention on you, but in this case, I think Adam Silver wants to make it very clear the NBA does not stand for that. And because of that, he's going to announce it after the finals and also to protect the finals as a whole. What do you think?
Yeah, I also wonder if Jaw knows his suspension or what it's gonna be. Like, I could also see like Adam Silver like talk it out with Jaw and then be like, okay, I'll meet with like a committee and decide on what's gonna happen, and then him come out and say it's gonna be announced after the finals. So Jaw Morant might be sitting in like suspense, which in defense, it's probably a good thing for him because he needs to learn. We all make mistakes, but he flashed a gun twice. Like, that's not a light thing to go about. And also, it's like he was singing to a song. Like, it's not like he was like trying like to defend himself or something like that. Like, he was literally singing to a song and putting an actual gun to his head. Like, that is that isn't something that should be taken lightly. So I do think he is waiting mostly to put a lot of light on this and humiliate John Morant because he needs to learn his lesson.
For sure. And I think the main thing behind this too is I don't think this is Adam Silver, the NBA, wanting to be a bad guy necessarily to John Morant. I think it's they're genuinely concerned and want to care for John Morant and trying to convey that putting a gun in that kind of situation could go really wrong really quickly. I mean, when you're waving a device that can kill people, anywhere from right here to right here, I mean, that's a lot of bad things that can happen in a split second. And that shouldn't happen to anybody. I mean, regardless if you're an NBA superstar or not. And I think that's the message that people close to John Morant are going to try to and want to convince to him. But ultimately, it's going to be up to John Morant to kind of accept that. And I don't know about you, but anytime I've been singing a song, I've never had an inclination to, oh, let me go pull up my Glock or whatever. That's you can have fun without doing those sorts of things. And I hope John Morant kind of comes around to that.
Yeah, and it is a little give and take. Like the NBA helps John Morant get a career, but John Morant also helps bring viewership to the NBA. So I do think the NBA is trying to probably do their best to fix John Morant's problems and help him for the future, because it's a give and take. I mean, they both need to succeed, or if they do both succeed, they both have a mutual benefit from it. So
Yeah,
I hope all goes well.
it's a win-win for them if John Morant doesn't put himself in harm and if John Morant doesn't put a negative connotation on the NBA. Okay, now let's move into our next segment, which I hope is going to get a little bit lively here. I want you, Chandler, to go ahead and rank the 2023 NBA head coaching vacancies and positions that are now filled, not in terms of who they got as a head coach, but as a destination. So if you were a head coach, how would you rank the top 1 through 6 of vacancies and positions that have been filled? Starting off with Phoenix, Detroit, Milwaukee, Houston, Philadelphia, and Toronto.
Okay, so number 6, I have the Toronto Raptors. I think they are in the void of depending or deciding on if they should compete or rebuild. And I think rebuilding is in their best interest, but I think the front office wants to compete. So I have them as last. I have the Rockets as number 5. They do have a young core, which can ascend to be great, but Jabari Smith Jr. was the second overall pick, and I don't really think we saw that much from him. Jalen Green is still super inefficient. Segun looks good, but that's about it. Now, Ime can bring them back, but right now I think they're a little rough. Number 4 is Philly. You have Embiid, but Embiid has shown not to show up in the playoffs. You also have other young players on that team that could arise to be better, but I I don't like Embiid as my number one superstar. I have 3 as the Pistons. Their young core of Duran, Ivy, and Cunningham, I love. But again, I love them. We gotta see if they will actually ascend to be a superstar, all stars, stuff like that. Number 2 is the Suns. You have 2 bona fide superstars in Booker and Durant, but the rest of the team is very depleted. So they're gonna need to fill out that roster. So that could be a great job, but if they don't fill out the roster, as we saw this year, they could lose second round pretty easily. And then one, I have the Bucks. They have all the pieces around them. I know they got to re-sign like Brooke Lopez, but I'm pretty sure all those guys they want to come back. They're older and they're upper age. I know Drew came out in an interview and saying how he wants to retire a Buck. So I think these guys want to stay there. And for the short term, I love the Bucks. I think they're the best position to go to right now. And you have Giannis, and if you have Giannis, you'll always be up there. So that's what I have. Thomas, what do you have?
Sounds good. Well, my ranking for NBA head coaching positions going into the 2023 season is number 6. I have the Toronto Raptors, and they're dead last because if you're a coach, at least to me, maybe it's been conveyed internally, but you don't know whether you're rebuilding or contending. I mean, we thought we'd get a clear answer at the trade deadline, but they made a trade to try to contend, and it got them nowhere. So I have them dead last. I think it's very clear that they are at the bottom of these 6 teams. Number 5, I have the 76ers, actually. I think the best thing going for them is Tyrese Maxey, and I think he's going to develop a lot going into the summer and next season. And him with Joel Embiid is going to be really exciting. However, what really scares me is of this list of 6 teams, there's 3 teams contending, right? The Suns, the Bucks, and the 76ers. I think the 76ers are by far in the worst position. They're basically hands tied around their back to James Harden. You don't know whether James Harden is going to try to walk to get a max contract out of Houston. And if he is, are you willing to match that? And how much is that going to cap your team? So I think the 76ers have a lot of salary cap issues ahead of them. And Joel Embiid hopefully will stay healthy. It was awesome seeing him healthy in the playoffs. Well, kind of in the playoffs. He missed a few games, but mostly healthy in the playoffs. But I have 76ers in number 5 for all those reasons. Number 4, I have the Rockets. So the difference between the Rockets and the Pistons to me is I think there's a lot of up and coming talent in the West as it is, and I don't see the contending teams in the West really falling off a cliff. I mean, the teams that are probably going to bounce back next season, like the Mavs, I don't really believe the Mavs are going to miss out on the playoffs again. I'd only expect the Kings, the Thunder, and the Grizzlies to get better over time. I think the Suns are going to complete their roster. We'll see what the Lakers do, the Clippers with their duo, but I think it's going to be very hard for the Rockets to get into a better position than they have in the last few years. Granted, their core of Jabari, Segun, and Green has been really good for them as a talent perspective, but we'll see how much Ime can develop them with his assistants coming in and how that operation all works. At number 4, oh, that was my number 4. At number 3, I have the Milwaukee Bucks, and I have them below the Suns because to me, I think the main difference between the Suns and the Bucks going forward is the Bucks are a really old team now, like a really old team. Most of their players are above 30. I mean, you mentioned the Brook Lopez situation, but they've got a lot of guys that you don't really know what's going to happen with. And my suspicion is that they're five guys. Oh, and they have a lot of questions as to what are we going to do to try to retool this team, because yes, they did have the best record in the NBA, but getting bounced in 5 to Miami is unacceptable if you're Milwaukee and you have this Giannis window of championships as a top 2 player in the NBA. So you've got a lot of questions to answer, such as Chris Middleton, what are we going to do with him? What does his future look like? How can we maximize Drew Holiday? And what pieces around Giannis can we necessarily put together? And if they move on from Mike Budenholzer 2 years after winning a championship as a head coach, I would be a little bit more concerned as to my time there rather than my time with the Suns per se. Number 2 for me, though, is the Detroit Pistons. I think, unlike the Rockets, there's a lot of room to grow for a really awesome young core in the East. I mean, they have Cade Cunningham, Jalen Durham, and Jaden Ivey now. I think that core is really going to bond together over the next few years. They've got another draft pick coming this summer, too. They're going to ascend, I think, a lot under Monty Williams. Granted, the rumor about Monty Williams is he's not the greatest in-game adjuster ever. However, he's a 2-time Coach of the Year, and that speaks volumes to me. And I think the East and the Pistons are going to be a position where they can compete for the playoffs almost next year. And they may get to the playoffs next year, but I think for sure in 2 years, they'll at least be a play-in team, if not a top 6 lock. And number 1 for me is the Suns. KD and Devin Booker might become the best duo in the league next year. They might put up some MVP numbers. It'll be the first Suns team where they can put an actual roster and actual pieces around those 2 guys, not including a midseason trade like we saw this year. And I think the Suns' perspective is going to be next year is going to be our year. This year was a great year to introduce KD into the system and get things going. But now the Suns have a new owner. Was it the wrong move firing Monty Williams? We'll see. But at least now they can have their guy. And if I was a head coach wanting to be in a position, the Suns would intrigue me the most for those 2 superstars having a ton of pieces around them, having the organization all behind you, and just wanting to move forward and competing for championships as soon as possible. And so that's my rankings of positions.
I have a question for you. If you were a coach right now in the NBA, so right now we have 3 positions. We have 3 positions of teams that are contending, 2 positions, and then 2 positions that are teams that are rebuilding. What do you think is the better situation to go into? Because as we've seen, you could win a championship and then get fired 2 years later. But then if you rebuild this team and you don't successfully rebuild and don't see growth every year, you also could get fired too. So, like, where would you think is, like, the better situation for you as a coach? Like, would you bank on winning, or would you bank on, like, proven success of, like, getting through the playoffs and, like, getting a better team each year?
Yeah, I mean, it all comes down for me to a risk and reward comparing the different situations, right? So I think the Suns over the Pistons is a better situation because your team is going to be ascending, and rather than looking at the Pistons to the Bucks, if the Bucks do not win with this aging core, I think it's kind of over for you. I mean, both the Bucks and the Suns moved on from their head coach, but I think it's going to be harder for the Bucks to win the championship next year than it is going to be to the Suns. I mean, I can only imagine the Celtics are going to get better and the 76ers are going to get better too, and that's 2 huge competitions that you have. Whereas in the West, I mean, we saw pretty much everybody was banged up, not 100% except for the Nuggets this year. And if the Suns can put together a roster and a core that can get them through the Western Conference playoffs, granted they went to 6 against the Nuggets, I can only imagine with the better team they'd probably go to 7. So I think the Suns are a better situation than the Pistons, but I think the Pistons are a better situation than the Bucks. But to answer your question, I think I would personally rather be on a rebuilding team, just because I know I have that assurance of not a ton of high expectations. All you really need to do is to build up the guys that you've drafted, and hopefully you can compete for the playoffs as soon as next year. But if you don't, you have that assurance from the owner and your general manager that you will be around to help keep developing and keep pushing these guys forward towards the playoff push in the years to come. And I think that's what I would really like to be on What would you like to be on?
I would also like to be on like a rebuilding team. I think it's just scary. So like let's think about the Bucks and the Suns in this situation. Now they both have one saving grace as their best player potentially, Booker and Giannis, but say after a year or two you don't win the championship and think about the Bucks if you have Brooke Lopez, Middleton, Drew Holiday, all of them either retire or just move on, you're done. Like you'll probably be a little worse and you probably will get fired because you won't succeed. I
Mm-hmm.
do think the saving grace for like the Suns is Booker by himself basically took his team to the finals already, which shows that even if KD moves off or retires in a couple years or so, that they can still be competitive in the West because they've proven they have. Whereas Giannis, I still think they'll be good if everyone leaves, but Giannis hasn't done it by himself yet. He always has Drew. He always has Middleton. He always has Brooke Lopez. You even have people like Bobby Portis putting off great minutes off the bench and stuff like that. So I do kind of agree with you that the Suns in the long term look great, but I think in the short term the Bucks are my pick. Um, Purely for the fact too of the West is tough. I mean, you got the Nuggets who are great right now, and I don't think they'll
Mm-hmm.
probably move off of anyone, and they still have a young core. You also have the Lakers who went to the conference finals, and they will definitely retool. The Warriors, if as long as they keep their core together, not going anywhere, and the Kings are just ascending. So I think the East is a little more up in the air. We
Mm-hmm.
don't know what's going to happen to Jalen Brown. The Cavs are still young, and they proved that they even lost to Knicks. So I like the Bucks in the short term, but if I was a coach that like if you don't win with the Bucks, you're probably getting fired. So if I was like a long term, I actually do kind of like the Suns where you're going with that, thinking that even if we don't win the championship with KD and Booker, we are keeping Booker no matter what, and he has proved that he can take us to the finals. And they were up 2-0 on the Bucks, so they can be in those situations. So that's kind
Definitely,
of
but
what I
I think
think.
where we see eye to eye is Detroit is a much better situation right now than Houston is as a rebuilding team. I mean, they're pretty much like the same kind of team with like their young cores and how they've been in the league the last few years. However, I think it's gonna be much easier for Piston to succeed in the future than it is for the Rockets, just because of how hard the West is, like you mentioned.
Yeah, I agree. I think Pistons are looking great. I mean, Cade Cunningham was hurt, I think, mostly all the season this year, so that was not the most fortunate thing ever. But Jaden Ivey took great steps. Jalen Durham, I mean, people are comparing him to the next Dwight, so I think he could ascend to something great. I do think the Rockets have a good young core. I just think for how high they were picked, that they might not live up to the potential that people think, like with Jalen Green and Jabari Smith Jr. I mean, Jabari Smith was like favorite to be picked number one until like a couple hours before the draft. So, and he hasn't
Mm-hmm.
turned out to be anything great. Now he still has years to improve, but and Ime can potentially ascend him into be a all star, but we'll see on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, switching gears into a different sport, the college football world, it's no surprise that the 2023 offseason and summer is also filled with conference realignment rumors and new teams coming to different conferences. And let's get into it because we have yet to discuss college football on this podcast. And that was something that we were kind of built off of. So let's just give a little bit of context for people that may not know the situation this summer and how it may affect future seasons ahead and the college football landscape as a whole. So a few months ago, all these leagues and conferences are trying to secure their new media rights deal. And that's important because it determines a large part of how the schools are getting paid. So you have conferences like the SEC and the Big Ten that are getting the most money because they're able to score the highest media deals, right?
Yep.
Well, this summer was a huge summer for the Pac 12 conference because their media deal was soon to expire and they really needed to get a new one done and a new one approved so they could prove to the schools in their conference that they are here to stay. The Pac-12 is not going anywhere. In fact, we're a growing league, and unfortunately for the Pac-12, the media rights deal has just been a disaster for them. I mean, there's talks of them abandoning ESPN and going full Amazon Prime Video for the Western Conference or for the western side of the United States. And we all know how hard it is as it was for the NFL just to get Thursday night football for people to tune in and watch. I can't even imagine how hard it'd be for the Pac 12. But you have those talks ongoing. It's not clear which cable networks are going to try to pick up the Pac 12 as a whole. And as a result, it came out this week that Colorado was having substantive talks with the Big 12 to move from the Pac 12 back into the Big 12. And additionally, the Big 12 was also looking at targeting both Arizona and Arizona State and Utah. I mean, could you imagine the fallout from the Pac 12 if those four schools left and came over here? I mean, it would just be complete chaos. So, what's your initial reaction to Colorado maybe going back to the Big 12, Big 12 also taking more schools with them, and the Pac 12's future amid all of these rumors going into the 2023 college football season in about 8 weeks?
Yeah, so my initial take on all this is, excuse my language, but this is a shit show. Like, teams are jumping everywhere.
Yeah.
Conferences are shrinking and expanding. I mean, we might get to a point where the Pac-12 has 5 teams and the Big 12 has 24. Like, that's how
Mm-hmm.
much conferences or teams are jumping from conference to conference. And there's different perspectives to look at this for each team. So when you have like teams like Cincinnati joining the Big 12, like that is great for them because now they're in a bigger market. They go against better competition. But then when you look at teams like in the conference, you might not like this because one, they might not be as good competition, and two, some of your other competition is leaving. I mean, OU and Texas, who probably bring in the most viewership in the Big 12, are leaving for the SEC. So I don't know. I also think we have to look at this as college football's changing. I mean, we're getting I think it's 12-man playoff, right? No,
Yep,
10,
not this season, but next
but
season.
next season, yeah, 12-man playoff. Like the college football scene is changing and it's going to change. And I think we kind of have to just accept it. Um, I still feel like it was yesterday where we were doing the BCS system and I loved it, but we're not going back. I mean, no matter how much we love it, like we're just not going back. And we have to accept it. I mean, I know there's probably a lot of old heads out there saying like this isn't how college football is supposed to be ran. Well, it's probably not, but it's changing. So I think we could see in the future where we have like 3 big conferences and they have like 20 some teams, which is hard to think about it, but it's just something we have to accept. But then also, I think something that everyone forgets about since football's so big is it will affect every other sport too. Like that's not something we think about. Like the basketball market, you even get to like say like lacrosse or track and field or swimming and stuff like that. Like all of those markets change, which I find it interesting. And I don't know like the logistics behind all that, but I think that's something super interesting to like look into and see how it affects all the other sports. But for football, um, I don't know. I think it makes it competitive. I wish they would do a thing where it's like in the NFL, you know how like you play like the team and like the AFC, uh, like like the Chiefs play the Eagles this year because they were in the Super Bowl. Like, what if they did something like that where like you for sure played like the same team you played like in the Big 12. Say like for now, I know these aren't the same teams, but say like uh Texas Tech played Kansas State in the Big 12 championship. Well, let's see that matchup the first week of conference play, next year. I think it'd be cool to see stuff like that. Um but times are changing and we got to accept it. If we like it or not, I mean they have more control than we do. So all we do is sit here and analyze it. So what do you think?
Yeah. So if I am Colorado, I have to get this deal back to the Big 12 done. You cannot, in this conference realignment era, be a team that is a reactor. And especially looking at USC and UCLA moving to the Big Ten last summer and will join in 2024, I think the writing is on the wall that without two of your four biggest schools in that conference, it's just only going to go down from there no matter who they can even bring. And as of right now, they don't have a plan to bring in anybody. So if I'm Colorado, I've got to get this deal done to Big 12. I've got to have some substantive talks to try to get a path forward for my program and for my university. And if I'm Colorado, I may be calling a few of my buddies, being like, hey, we've got to get out of here. This is a sinking ship. It may be slowly sinking, but it's for sure sinking. With the USC and UCLA news, and on top of that, the media right deal news, I think this is only just going to be bad news. Is getting worse for the Pac-12. And if I'm the Pac-12 commissioner, I would be upset. But also, you have to look at it like you're kind of failing. Like, this is kind of on you and your league, and you're not doing a good job of keeping your guys around. And I would not be surprised if we saw those four schools leave to see teams like Oregon and Washington reach out to other conferences around the country asking if they could join. But I think this is all just a downward spiral for the Pac 12, and eventually we're just going to see the Big Four conferences.
I also think with Colorado, they are very boomer bust right now. They
Mm.
got a very loud coach. I don't know how great he'll be. I think they just need to capitalize on this and get into the best situation they can, even if it's a failure. The worst case scenario is they'll be in the Big 12 and they'll be the worst ones in the Big 12. And what is that any difference from last year in the Pac 12? I mean, they stormed the field after they won one game. So if that kind of shows you where their program was at. So this could be a big boom move, but I think with having Sanders on your team and having his son too, who people think he could go top pick in the NFL draft, I think really trying to push the agenda now of switching conferences is exactly what you need.
Definitely. Well, and I don't really think it's coincidence that Deion Sanders gets there, and all of a sudden Colorado is looking at moving on from the Pac-12. I mean, when Deion was playing, Colorado was a powerhouse in the Big 12. So I don't think it would be too unrealistic to say that is Deion Sanders responsible for the downfall of the Pac-12 if Colorado moves back to the Big 12? I don't know. It's going to be something very interesting to watch, but I do know Colorado would not make that move without first consulting Deion Sanders. So this is going to be a really interesting situation to watch in the future as we move forward into this season. We keep hearing these rumors from the media rights deals, and hopefully we'll hear some rumblings from other schools as to what they're trying to do, how they're trying to position themselves. Because the schools that are not trying to make a move first, but will ultimately be a reactor to the news happening to them, they're just going to get screwed in the market. And that's kind of how I view it. So the schools that could take advantage of the situation now, like USC and UCLA did, I think they're going to be in a much better position than all these teams that are just in a sitting and waiting game.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you say. Um, the college football scene is changing, and those teams need to be on it. Like I give the Colorado president or whatever you want to call it, I give him a lot of credit because I heard they didn't even have the money at the moment to pay for Sanders, but they got on it. They jumped on it. They knew they needed to change their program around, and I even if they're not that great this year, I think in the future they will be good. And I do think Sanders at Colorado is the LeBron of wherever LeBron's at. Like they will consult with Sanders no matter what happens because Sanders will run that program by the end of it, which it's not always a bad thing that he's like running it basically. But um, if they show success, why not? And why not jump into a conference that you're going to get more money from having better media rights and you're going to be in better competition where, as we've seen in the Pac 12, not very many teams make the college football playoffs because they don't really value those teams to be as good.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Um, we will see. I mean, the big question for the relationship with Colorado and Dion is will Dion actually succeed? And I think that's really the only thing that matters. Whether they stay in the Pac 12, the Big 12, if they don't win, I'm not sure there will be a return to glory days in the near time future. But I think that kind of wraps up everything for today. So I would say this concludes the third episode of the Atlas Sports Podcast. Thank you guys for watching. You can catch us on Twitch, YouTube, and TikTok at Atlas_sports, Instagram, Atlas Sports underscore, and Twitter, Atlas1Sports. Forgot that last one. But thank you guys all for tuning in today, and catch you guys in the next one.